The courtroom felt like a tomb, its oppressive silence pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. I sat there, Matthew Carter, my shoulders slumped and my hands trembling in my lap, feeling utterly defeated. The air was thick with judgment, I could see it in their eyes, the jury's cold stares, the prosecutor's smug grin, even the pitying glances from strangers who had already written me off as guilty. Every piece of evidence pointed to me, fabricated witnesses, falsified documents. It was all so meticulously planned that not even my lawyer seemed to believe we stood a chance anymore. My fate hung precariously over a cliff, ready to plummet into an abyss of despair. As the judge prepared for his final verdict, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to leave this world without saying goodbye to the one being who truly mattered, Titan, my loyal German shepherd. "Your Honor," I pleaded, my voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "Please, let me see Titan one last time." Gasps echoed through the room. Some muttered disapproval while others exchanged uneasy looks. Was I insane? A man facing death asking for a dog? It sounded absurd, but it was all I cared about. For what felt like eternity, the judge hesitated, his stern expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded curtly, granting my request. When the wooden doors creaked open moments later, revealing Titan led by an officer, the tension in the room reached its breaking point. Titan entered slowly, his deep-set eyes scanning until they found mine. In that instant, everything else faded, the murmurs, the stares, the looming specter of doom. Titan lunged forward, pulling hard against the leash, his howl slicing through the silence like a blade. Tears streamed down my face as I collapsed onto the floor, clutching him desperately. He was more than just a dog, he was my lifeline, my last connection to humanity. But amidst our reunion, I couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that something darker loomed ahead. Why had Titan been brought here now? And why did everyone seem so unsettled by his... The courtroom, once heavy with silence, seemed to freeze entirely as the wooden doors creaked open. All eyes turned toward the figure of Titan, a robust German shepherd led by an officer into the center of the room. The tension was palpable. Every step Titan took echoed like thunder against the marble floor. His ears were perked up, his deep-set eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto Matthew's trembling form. In that instant, something extraordinary happened. Titan lunged forward with such force that the officer holding him nearly stumbled backward. The dog's leash stretched taut, and for a moment it felt as if the entire world had been reduced to this single connection between man and beast. Matthew, who had been sitting slumped in his chair moments before, collapsed onto the floor as Titan reached him. Tears streamed uncontrollably down his face, his controlled demeanor shattering into raw emotion. He clutched the dog tightly, burying his face in Titan's thick fur as sobs racked his body. "I'm so sorry, my friend," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the muffled gasps from the audience. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some turning away to hide their own tears. It was impossible not to feel the weight of the moment, a condemned man finding solace in the unconditional love of his loyal companion. But just as the reunion reached its peak, something unsettling occurred. Titan suddenly stiffened in Matthew's arms, his growls low and guttural. His gaze darted sharply toward a dim corner of the courtroom, where shadows pooled unnaturally. The dog's behavior was unmistakably protective, as though he sensed a hidden threat lurking nearby. A chill swept through the room, and even the judge leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed in confusion. Was it paranoia, or was there truly someone or something watching them? Before anyone could process what was happening, Titan abruptly turned his attention back to Matthew. With startling determination, he began tugging at the pocket of Matthew's suit jacket, his teeth gripping the fabric firmly. Matthew tried to calm him, gently pushing him away, but Titan persisted, his movements urgent and deliberate. Finally, a crumpled piece of paper slipped from the pocket and fluttered to the ground. For a brief second, time seemed to stop. Every eye in the courtroom widened in disbelief as the defense attorney scrambled to pick it up. When he unfolded the paper, his expression shifted from shock to awe. "Your Honor," the lawyer exclaimed, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "We need to suspend the proceedings immediately. This..." This could change everything. Chaos erupted around them. Whispers filled the air, and the prosecutor shot to his feet, demanding answers. Matthew stared at the scene unfolding before him, his mind racing. What was this paper? How had it ended up in his pocket? And why had Titan acted as though he knew exactly where to find it? As the commotion swirled, Matthew held on to Titan with trembling hands, drawing strength from the warmth of the dog's body pressed against his own. He looked into Titan's eyes, searching for answers. There was no mistaking the intelligence in those dark pools, not just loyalty, but a kind of almost human certainty, as though Titan understood far more than anyone gave him credit for. For the first time since the trial began, Matthew allowed himself to entertain the faintest glimmer of hope. But hope, he knew all too well, came at a price. If this paper revealed what it promised, it would mean unraveling a conspiracy far larger than himself, and putting both him and Titan in even greater danger. The courtroom was a powder keg waiting to explode as the defense attorney held up the crumpled piece of paper, his hands trembling slightly but his voice steady. "Your Honor," he began, his tone sharp and urgent, "this document contains evidence of a bank transaction directly tied to my client's account, a transaction that occurred days before the alleged crime." The room erupted into chaos, whispers spreading like wildfire as everyone tried to process what had just been revealed. Matthew sat frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure whether this discovery was salvation or another cruel twist of fate. The prosecutor shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "This is preposterous. Where did this so-called evidence come from? It reeks of fabrication." His words hung heavy in the air, dripping with accusation. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but the tension in the room was palpable. Eyes darted between Matthew, the lawyer, and the mysterious scrap of paper that had suddenly turned the tide of the trial. Some spectators stood abruptly, their faces pale, and hurried toward the exit as if fleeing an impending disaster. Even the bailiff seemed uneasy, glancing nervously at the door as though expecting something or someone to burst through at any moment. Matthew's mind raced. He couldn't remember how the paper had ended up in his pocket, nor could he explain Titan's inexplicable behavior earlier. Yet there it was, undeniable proof staring back at him from the page. A deposit made into his account by an unknown source, large enough to suggest motive for the crime he was accused of committing. "If I didn't put it there, then who did?" he thought, dread pooling in his stomach. Was this planted to frame him further, or was it a clue left behind by whoever orchestrated the conspiracy? The defense attorney leaned over to whisper urgently to Matthew. "This could be our lifeline, but tread carefully. If this is authentic, it proves you were set up, but if it's fake, it could seal your fate." Matthew nodded numbly, his grip tightening on Titan's leash as the dog sat loyally beside him, his deep-set eyes scanning the room with an almost human awareness. There was something unnerving about the way Titan kept growling softly under his breath, his gaze fixed on a group of men near the back of the courtroom. Were they merely spectators, or were they part of the shadowy forces working against him? As the judge announced a recess to allow time for verification of the document, the atmosphere shifted into something darker. Whispers grew louder, more frantic, and Matthew felt the weight of unseen eyes boring into him. Someone in the crowd muttered, "He's playing with fire," loud enough for him to hear. A chill ran down his spine. He glanced at the prosecutor, whose smug expression had faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. For the first time, Matthew wondered if even the prosecution hadn't been fully aware of the depth of the scheme unraveling before them. Outside the courtroom, the lawyer pulled Matthew aside, his voice low and tense. "Listen carefully. This transaction traces back to a shell company linked to powerful individuals. If we dig deeper, we might uncover the mastermind behind all of this, but it won't be safe. Whoever set you up will stop at nothing to protect themselves." Matthew swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked down at Titan, whose unwavering loyalty gave him strength. "I don't care what it takes," he said firmly. "If this paper can prove my innocence, I'll risk everything." But as they returned to the courtroom, Matthew noticed subtle changes in the environment. Guards stationed near the doors exchanged wary glances, and a man in a dark suit lingered conspicuously close to the judge's bench. The sense of danger was suffocating, yet Matthew refused to back down. The truth was within reach, and he would fight tooth and nail to expose it, even if it meant stepping into the lion's den. As Matthew sat in the cold, suffocating silence of his cell, memories began to flood back pieces of a puzzle he had ignored or dismissed as paranoia. He remembered the strange men who had followed him weeks before his arrest, their menacing stares cutting through the crowded streets like daggers. They never spoke, but their presence was a constant reminder that he was being watched. Then came the anonymous calls, crackling voices on the other end whispering threats too vague to report but too chilling to ignore. At the time, Matthew had convinced himself it was all in his head, stress manifesting as fear. But now everything clicked into place. He wasn't just unlucky. He had been targeted. The woman's visit earlier only confirmed his worst fears. Dressed impeccably, with an air of calculated calm, she revealed herself as someone who knew far more than she should. "You're not random," she said, her voice low and deliberate, each word landing like a hammer blow. "John Everett chose you because no one would question why you ended up guilty." The name sent a shiver down Matthew's spine. Everett, a man whose wealth and influence stretched across industries and political circles, was untouchable, a shadowy figure pulling strings from behind closed doors. And somehow, unknowingly, Matthew had become a pawn in his deadly game. Before leaving, the woman slid a folded note under the glass divider, her hands trembling slightly despite her composed exterior. "Ask about the fire," she whispered urgently, her eyes darting around as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "It's connected to where you found Titan. But be careful, they don't leave loose ends." Her warning lingered long after she disappeared, the weight of her words pressing down on Matthew like a leaden blanket. Matthew replayed her message over and over in his mind, trying to piece together its meaning. The shelter where he adopted Titan, a place filled with barking dogs and weary volunteers, had seemed ordinary at the time. Yet now every memory felt tainted, every detail suspicious. What fire was she talking about? Why would something so mundane be tied to such a sinister plot? His thoughts raced, colliding with fragments of Titan's behavior, the scars on his body, the way he sometimes stared into empty corners as though sensing danger, the almost human certainty in his eyes during critical moments. Each revelation brought new questions, tightening the knot of dread in Matthew's chest. If he pursued this trail, he risked stepping directly into the crosshairs of people who wouldn't hesitate to kill. But if he didn't, he might never uncover the truth, and worse, Titan could still be in danger. For the first time since his arrest, Matthew felt a flicker of resolve burning through the fog of despair. Whoever these people were, whatever they had done, they had underestimated one thing: the bond between him and Titan. That unbreakable connection gave him strength, even as the walls of his cell seemed to close in tighter. The lawyer's investigation led them to a chilling revelation that tied Titan directly to the heart of Everett's sinister empire. Buried in old records and charred documents was evidence that Titan had once been part of a sprawling rural property owned by John Everett, a place masquerading as a quiet farm but secretly operating as a hub for illegal activities. Dogfighting rings, smuggling operations, and underground deals were orchestrated within its walls. The more Matthew learned, the heavier the truth weighed on him. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about exposing the dark underbelly of power that had consumed innocent lives, including those of animals like Titan. But the most horrifying detail came when the layer uncovered the origins of the fire that destroyed the property. It wasn't an accident or an act of nature, it was deliberate arson, set by Everett himself to erase all traces of wrongdoing. Bodies of dogs left behind bore witness to the brutality of the man who had orchestrated their suffering. "Titan survived that hell," the layer said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "He's not just a victim, he's living proof of what Everett tried to bury." Matthew felt bile rise in his throat as he imagined Titan trapped in that inferno, chained and terrified, forced to fight for survival against impossible odds. The scars on Titan's body weren't merely physical, they were etched into his soul, reminders of the horrors he'd endured. Every flinch at sudden noises, every protective growl, every moment Titan seemed to sense danger before anyone else. It all made sense now. He wasn't just a loyal companion, he was a survivor carrying the weight of unspeakable trauma. What struck Matthew hardest was how close he had come to losing Titan forever without ever knowing the full story. If he hadn't adopted him from that shelter, if Titan hadn't somehow managed to escape the flames, none of this would have surfaced. The realization filled Matthew with both gratitude and guilt. Gratitude because Titan had become his lifeline, and guilt because he couldn't shake the feeling that he owed the dog so much more than he could ever repay. As the layer laid out photographs of the burned barn and the symbols, painted on its wall, symbols matching those found in other properties linked to Everett, Matthew clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. "This isn't over," he muttered through gritted teeth. Everett thought he erased everything, but Titan survived. And now we're going to make sure the world knows exactly what kind of monster he is. The room fell silent except for the faint rustling of papers. Outside, storm clouds gathered, casting long shadows across the city. Matthew looked down at Titan, whose deep-set eyes seemed to hold secrets older than time itself. For the first time, Matthew truly understood why fate had brought them together. They weren't just fighting for justice, they were fighting for redemption. As the days dragged on in the suffocating confines of his cell, Matthew began to piece together the horrifying truth. He wasn't just a random victim of circumstance. He had been deliberately chosen because of Titan. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Everett's empire of crime rested on secrets buried deep beneath layers of manipulation and violence, and Titan was one of the last living threads tying it all together. By adopting the dog, Matthew had unknowingly placed himself at the center of a deadly conspiracy. Saving Titan hadn't only saved an abused animal. It had made Matthew a target. The signs were everywhere now, impossible to ignore. A group of inmates who rarely interacted with anyone else suddenly took an unsettling interest in him. Their eyes followed him during yard time, their whispers trailing behind him like shadows. Even the guards seemed complicit, exchanging loaded glances or lingering too long near his cell. It wasn't paranoia, it was real. Someone wanted him silenced, and they weren't subtle about it anymore. Every creak of the hallway outside his cell felt like a countdown to something inevitable. One night, as Matthew lay awake on the thin mattress, the oppressive silence was shattered by faint footsteps echoing down the corridor. They stopped directly in front of his cell. His heart pounded as he crept closer to the door, peering through the narrow slit of the barred window. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a hulking silhouette clutching what looked unmistakably like a knife. The blade glinted under the dim fluorescent light, its purpose clear. Matthew froze, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't just intimidation. This was an execution order. Whoever stood on the other side of that door wasn't there to negotiate or warn, they were there to end him. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. But then, as if summoned by sheer willpower, memories of Titan flooded his mind. The dog's unwavering loyalty, the way he had risked everything to expose the crumpled paper and cord it, reminded Matthew why he couldn't give up. Titan had fought for him when no one else could. Now, it was Matthew's turn to fight back. He scanned the room frantically, searching for anything he could use to defend himself. There was nothing, just the cold walls and the biting reality of his vulnerability. The footsteps resumed, moving away as quickly as they had come. Matthew exhaled shakily, sinking to the floor. Whoever it was, they hadn't acted tonight, but they would return. And next time, he might not be so lucky. The investigation took a darker turn when the lawyer uncovered undeniable links between Everett and the fire that had destroyed Titan's former shelter. Documents revealed that Everett had orchestrated the arson to erase evidence of his illegal dogfighting ring. But the most damning piece was the testimony of a former employee who claimed first-hand knowledge of Everett's crimes. For Matthew, this felt like their final lifeline, a chance to expose the truth once and for all. But fate seemed determined to test them further. Just hours before the trial, news broke that the witness had been found dead in his apartment, an apparent assassination disguised as a robbery. The blow was devastating. They were back at square one, staring into the abyss of uncertainty. When the courtroom doors opened for the new hearing, tension hung thick in the air. Every seat was occupied, whispers rippling through the crowd like wildfire. As the prosecution laid out its counter-arguments, Matthew clenched his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. They dismissed the evidence against Everett as circumstantial, painting Matthew once again as a desperate man clutching at straws. This is nothing more than conjecture. The prosecutor bellowed, slamming documents onto the table with theatrical force. Matthew glanced at Titan, whose unwavering gaze seemed to say, "We've come too far to give up now." It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore, it was about justice for every life ruined by Everett's greed. The lawyer fought valiantly, presenting photos of the barn where Titan had been kept, bank records linking Everett to fraudulent transactions, and even fragments of the charred documents salvaged from the fire. Yet, each argument met fierce resistance, leaving Matthew teetering on the edge of despair. For a moment, it seemed as though hope itself might crumble under the weight of Everett's influence. But then something shifted. A juror leaned forward, her expression thoughtful, as if seeing the case in a new light. The judge adjusted his glasses, scrutinizing the evidence with renewed intensity. Matthew held his breath, clinging to the faintest glimmer of possibility. The battle wasn't over yet, not while Titan stood steadfast beside him. The courtroom erupted into a mix of gasps and murmurs as the judge delivered his final verdict. "Matthew Carter is innocent," he declared, his voice firm and resonant, cutting through the tension like a blade. The weight that had crushed Matthew for months lifted, but only partially. He looked over at Titan, who stood beside him, tail wagging with an almost human understanding. For the first time in what felt like forever, Matthew allowed himself to breathe deeply. Yet, even amidst the relief, a shadow lingered. John Everett, the mastermind behind it all, had fled the country before authorities could apprehend him. His escape was a stark reminder that while justice had been served today, the battle wasn't truly over. Outside the courthouse, sunlight bathed the steps, casting long shadows across the pavement. Matthew stepped out into the fresh air, Titan walking steadfastly by his side. Reporters shouted questions from behind barricades, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. But Matthew barely noticed them. His attention was drawn instead to a sleek black car parked several yards away. Its tinted windows reflected the afternoon sun, obscuring whoever or whatever was inside. The license plate was deliberately concealed, and though the vehicle didn't move, its presence felt menacing, like a predator waiting to strike. Matthew tightened his grip on Titan's leash, his heart pounding despite the joy of vindication. "We're not safe yet," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the dog. Titan stopped abruptly, his ears perked up, and let out a low growl directed toward the car. Matthew froze, scanning the area around him. The street seemed ordinary, enough people passing by, cars honking, but something about that car sent chills down his spine. It was clear, Everett's reach extended far beyond borders, and those loyal to him weren't going to let this go without a fight. Despite the looming threat, Matthew couldn't deny the small flicker of hope burning within him. As they walked away from the courthouse, the world ahead stretched out uncertainly, full of challenges yet unmet. Still, he found solace in one undeniable truth: no matter how dark things got, Titan had always stood by him. That bond, the unwavering loyalty between man and beast, had carried them through insurmountable odds. "Let's go home, boy," Matthew said softly, his voice tinged with both determination and unease. Titan glanced up at him, his deep-set eyes filled with trust. Together, they disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind the chaos of the courthouse. The future remained unpredictable, fraught with danger, but also brimming with possibilities. Justice might have prevailed today, but Matthew knew better than anyone that freedom came at a price, and that vigilance would be their shield moving forward.